start the talk, I would like all of you to please mute yourself, because that would be problem to all of us. There will be a noise. We cannot hear Professor Noam Chomsky clearly. So I would request every single person, please, we have a large audience throughout the world. People are watching right now. So we are so fortunate to have Professor Chomsky with us right now. So we just want to request all of you to please mute yourself. Unless you mute, you will not be able to hear Professor Chomsky clearly. So please do mute yourself.
Yes. असरफ देख जहाँ से ट्राई कर रहे हैं ना, वहाँ से बहुत मजा आ रहा है, उनको बोलिए नहीं ट्राई करने के लिए.
Yeah, please, that's what I am requesting every single person. Who is Ashraf Beg, please mute yourself. Everyone, please. It is a rare opportunity for all of us that we have with us the legend academician of the world, and it is very, we are fortunate to have him, and he is so generous. He is so generous to agree to speak at this occasion. So without taking much of the time, that the talk will be organized in such a way that Professor Noam Chomsky will be speaking after my brief introduction. It is like 40 minutes, 1 hour, how long, whatever convenient for him, it is up to him to speak. We may give brief 10 minutes for question answers. Professor, my colleague, senior colleague, my teacher, Professor Hasnain will take few questions from the audience. I will request all the participants, because this is large participants, more than 1,000 people, and it's coming up, so it will may go up. 2,000, 3,000 people all around the world will be watching this talk. So, I will request Professor Hasnain to take few questions, and then at the end, Professor Shabana Hamid, our another colleague, will propose vote of thanks. So, this is the sequence of the talk by Professor Noam Chomsky. We are very, fortunate, as I said earlier, to have him and to see him. We were so excited. Our university, our Vice Chancellor, all officials were so excited having heard the name of Professor Noam Chomsky, and for the audience, he visited India twice in 1996 and in 2001, I remember, and gave series of talks at different places, including Delhi University, JNU, and Southern India. And so we are so fortunate to see him, and I to say a few words about him. Before that, since the Department of Linguistics at Aligarh Muslim University is organizing this, so I briefly will touch upon the brief history about the Aligarh Muslim University, which occupies a unique position amongst universities and institutions of higher learning in India. It was established in 1877 as Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College, which have become a full-fledged university in 1920, and it was started by a great visionary and social reformer, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. From its very inception, it has kept its door open to the of all communities and from all corners of the country and the world. The Aligarh Muslim University is the realization of a vision which was broad, far-reaching, and realistic. Around 33,000 students are studying in this university, and it is a residential university. AMU is a living symbol of composite culture of India and a bulwark of its secular principles. Our Department of Linguistics was founded in 1968. Since its inception, the department has been providing excellent teaching and in-depth research in linguistics with special reference to Urdu language. Department of Linguistics is one of the very few departments in India which offer a full-fledged undergraduate course in linguistics. The University Grant Commission, which controls all the academic institutions in India, recognize the scholarly contributions of the department in terms of teaching and research, as well as the quantum of individual projects successfully carried out by its faculty members, and thus awarded a special assistance program to the Department of Linguistics. The phase 1 and phase 2 of DRSSAP have been completed. So with these few words about the department and about the university, I welcome you all to this great talk by Professor Noam. The people are watching from across country, many countries, from US, from Philippines, I can see from Morocco, from Yemen, from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, so and all around India. So we are so fortunate to have him, the great scholar with us. So I'm just, as we all know that Professor Noam Chomsky is the father of modern linguistics, is one of the most cited scholars in modern history. Among his groundbreaking books are Syntactic Structure, Language and Mind, Aspects of Theory of Syntax, and the Minimalist Program, each of which has made distinct contributions to the development of the field. He has received numerous awards, including Kyoto Prize in Basic Sciences, the Helmholtz Medal, and the Ben Franklin Medal in Computer and Cognitive Science. Professor Noam Chomsky is credited with revolutionizing the linguistic field by introducing the Chomsky hierarchy, generative grammar, and the concept of a universal grammar which underlies all human speech and is based in the innate structure of mind and brain. Professor Chomsky has not only transformed the field of linguistics, Chomsky's work has also influenced the field of cognitive science, philosophy, psychology, computer science, mathematics, childhood education, and anthropology. Application of his work can be found in everyday life. He formulated the algorithm context-free grammar, which is part of most computer programming languages as well as programs that appear to understand language. He also challenged traditional notions of learning. Public intellectual in the world, Chomsky has been the 7 biographies, has been interviewed countless times in popular media, and has appeared in over 20 films and documentaries. He has written more than 100 books, his most recently in Requiem for the American Dream, the 10 Principles of Concentration of Wealth and Power. Professor Chomsky's fame has extended into popular culture, leading such fans as Bono of U2 to describe him as Elvis of academia. Professor Noam Chomsky's Facebook page has more than 1.2 million followers. You can imagine his popularity and the generations of the linguistics he trained. We are fortunate to have got the opportunity to interact with one of the most influential scholars and thought leaders of the present world. This is a rare privilege for all of us to have him speaking from our department. So thank you, Professor Noam, for being so generous to be here. I do not want to go longer because I cannot have words to say anything in introduction which will be less than what you are as a great genius of this century. So I will stop the introduction. I know the people know you all. If I'll go along, the entire time I will spend introducing yourself, which even won't be sufficient. So with this brief introduction, I'm going to talk about say a few words about the abstract of his talk. Professor Noam Chomsky will be speaking on the human capacity, language, and thought. Paleoanthropologist Alexander Marschak coined the term the human capacity to denote the elusive quality that makes humans so distinctive. When we inquire into this elusive quality, we find 2 striking properties: language and thought. And this thought is any way we can grasp and can study. A plausible conclusion then is that they are identical. Language is a system for generating thought, and thought is what is generated by language. That is the answer that resonates through intellectual history until the 20th century and has been disrupted in the generative enterprise and independently in the study of human evolution. So he will be talking on these lines. So with this brief introduction and about this topic, I would like to welcome Professor Noam Chomsky to speak on the human capacity, language, and thought. Thank you all, and over to Professor Noam Chomsky.
Thank you very much. A good place to begin is at the beginning. That's 2,500 years ago, as far back as detailed records go. That's when the priestess at the Delphic oracle issued a pronouncement defining our primary task, know thyself. Well, the two-word aphorism can be interpreted in many ways. Given what we now know today and what should be uppermost in our minds, a reasonable way to interpret the oracle is in collective terms, as urgent advice to try to understand what kind of creatures we are. And we are indeed strange beasts, that once the pride of evolutionary history, at the same time the scourge of the earth. It's a challenge to find out how this could be, and an imperative to find out in time so that we can fend off the worst and aspire to the best. Humans appeared very recently in the evolutionary record, 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. It's a blink of an eye in evolutionary time. Not surprisingly, there's very little diversity among humans. The slight differences are what matter for life. The commonalities we take for granted. For understanding ourselves, the proper stance is the exact opposite. What is deeply important and most revealing is what is common to us, distinguishing humans so radically from other life on Earth. Variation is superficial. That much is true on pure intellectual grounds, but also in its import on human life. It's not news that we are at a unique moment in human history, a moment when decisions have to be made quickly and decisively as to whether human society will persist in any organized form. We're living at a moment of confluence of severe crises, existential ones. All are collective, no boundaries. We will answer them together or not at all, in which case the human experiment will come to an inglorious end. It's a critical topic, which I'll have to put aside for lack of time. For good reasons, then, we should interpret the advice of the oracle collectively. What kind of creatures are we? What are the species properties that are common to humans, apart from severe pathology, and are without significant analog elsewhere in the living world, even among our closest relatives, the higher apes? These are the properties that paleoanthropologists call the human capacity. Well, when we inquire into this question, I think we find two striking properties that satisfy this austere criterion: language and thought. At least thought in any way that we can grasp and study. It's language and thought that enable humans to issue the proclamation of the oracle, to reflect on its meaning, to seek to find answers to the questions it awakens in our minds. And the same is true of the most mundane experiences of ordinary human life, all common to humans, and in important ways distinctive to the human species. Well, if inquiry reveals two distinct properties that virtually define the species, the next question is, what relation holds between them? The simplest answer would be the relation of identity. Language is a system for generating thought. Thought is what is generated by language. Now that, in fact, is the answer that was given at about the same time as the oracle in classical India by the famous Sanskrit scholar Bhartrhari, one of the founders of the great tradition of Indian grammar and philosophy. In his conception, I'm quoting, language is not the vehicle of meaning or the conveyor of thought, but rather its generative principle. Thought anchors language, and language anchors thought. Using language is thinking, and thought vibrates through language. In classical Greece, at roughly the same time, a similar answer was given by Aristotle. He distinguished abstract words from spoken words. The spoken words vary from language to language in ways that he found of little interest. The former, the abstract words, are the symbols of mental experience, which is the same for all. These are the basic components of propositional thought, of affirmation and denial, based on subject and predication. Well, our ideas resonate through intellectual history. Skipping on to the 16th century, the Spanish physician, philosopher Juan Horta set the stage for the first cognitive revolution, which followed shortly after. He emphasized what he called the generative quality of human understanding, unique to humans, the capacity that we constantly exercise in normal life in using language to construct new thoughts, to interpret those of others. Horta also identified a still higher form of intelligence, a form that enables some to create work of true intellectual and aesthetic value, while the rest of us, lacking this talent, are at least able to enjoy and appreciate it, sometimes carry it forward. Another species property that derives from the language thought complex. Horta also insisted on the universality of language structure, on the brain for cognitive functions, and on the innateness of functions, along with the generative quality of human understanding. These ideas have been revived without any awareness of the long-forgotten history in what is called the cognitive revolution of the 1950s. It was a sharp break from the then prevailing structuralist behaviorist doctrines. These ideas flourished during the 17th century scientific revolution, which led to the basis for modern science. A core part of this revolution was the willingness to be puzzled about simple things, ordinarily just taken for granted. So why do rocks fall to the earth while steam rises? Why do we see a certain visual presentation as a triangle? Scientists of the 17th century were not satisfied with what they called the occult ideas that were invoked to account expressed their awe and wonder about a truly remarkable fact. With a few symbols, each of us can construct infinitely many thoughts in our minds. We can even convey to others who have no access to our minds their most innermost workings. For Descartes, this normal, creative use of language, employing this capacity, was a foundation for his postulating a second substance, res cogitans, thinking substance, relating language and thought, a substance unique to humans in his metaphysics. Galileo himself regarded the alphabet as the most spectacular of human inventions because it captured this marvel. Galileo's amazement was echoed years later by Gottlob Frege, the founder of modern logic, modern philosophy, logical philosophy. Frege, quoting him, found astonishing what language accomplishes. With a few syllables, it expresses a countless number of thoughts, and even for a thought grasped for the first time, it provides a clothing in which it can be recognized by another, to whom it is also entirely new. The amazement of these great thinkers is entirely warranted, as is their insistence on puzzlement over what seems self-evident. The insight poses what we might call the Galilean challenge. How is this achievement possible? The challenge seems to me to capture lucidly the major task faced by the inquiry into the nature of language and thought, and into the unique nature of the human species. The Galilean challenge enabled a rich tradition of what was called general and rational grammar. General because it sought universal principles underlying human languages. Rational because it sought to go beyond description to explanation. Throughout, language was generally regarded as intimately bound to thought. The common understanding was captured simply in the 19th century linguists, William Dwight Whitney, in his phrase that language is audible thought, though we now recognize that speech, sound, does not have that unique status. Any sensory facility will serve. The great humanist, founder of the modern research university, Wilhelm von Humboldt, went further, identifying language with thought. He characterized language as a generative activity and pondered the fact that somehow this activity makes infinite use of finite means, a basic feature of the Galilean challenge. Humboldt's formulation of the Galilean challenge brings to light a serious gap in the entire tradition. It failed to accommodate Aristotle's crucial distinction between possession of knowledge and use of knowledge, contemporary terms, competence and performance. The tradition kept entirely to use of knowledge, more specifically, use of knowledge in production of speech. Little was said about perception of speech. It's a prime concern of modern psycholinguistics. Both production and perception access the knowledge that is internally possessed. Well, appropriate means were not available to formulate clearly and to investigate the fundamental task to unearth the system of knowledge possessed, internal language, what is called I-language in modern technical usage. This gap was overcome by the modern theory of computation, which was created by Alan Turing, other great early 20th century mathematicians, and was adopted in the modern reshaping. These tools are Aristotle's forgotten distinction between possession and use of knowledge made it possible to launch serious study of possession of knowledge for the first time. That does not entirely resolve Humboldt's puzzle of production, but it makes it possible to carve out the domain of feasible inquiry, the study of the generation of the knowledge possessed with finite means and infinite scope. Production of language, like other creative action, is beyond the reach of inquiry in any fundamental sense, as is even simple voluntary action. The distinction between generation and production of language is fundamental and commonly misunderstood. Generation lays out the terrain. Here are the linguistically formulated thoughts. Production is an activity which makes use of these thoughts, commonly in innovative and creative ways that are not understood. In Cartesian terms, our use of language is appropriate to circumstances, but not caused by them.
Professor Noam, please unmute your mic. Professor Noam, you unmute your mic. Your mic has got muted. Your microphone has got muted. Please unmute your mic is muted. You need to unmute your mic. उससे साइलेंस पे करिए उनका चॉम्स्की सर का माइक म्यूट हो गया है म्यूट कर
How's that?
yeah
Yes, sir.
Okay, sorry. Well, let me just go back a little. The distinction between generation and production of language is fundamental, commonly misunderstood. Generation basically lays out the terrain. It is here are the thoughts that are linguistically formulated. Production is different. It's an activity that makes use of these thoughts, commonly does so in innovative, creative ways that are not understood in the standard terms of Cartesian.
Sir, again you have got muted. Professor Noam.
How's that?
Yes. Again, it's okay now.
Oh, why that's happening?
We haven't missed anything, so you can continue. Again, it's got muted. I don't know why it is happening. I can see the symbol of mute here.
Is it on?
No, yeah, it's on now.
Well, let's try. The new tools of computation made it possible for the first time to develop explanatory theories of language, theories externalized in some sensory motor medium, usually sound. That's what we call the basic property of language. As soon as this enterprise was undertaken, problems arose. The reigning structural behaviorist consensus had no real puzzles. Everything essential was known. Procedures of analysis could be applied to any corpus of materials. As soon as the search for explanation began, it turned out that almost nothing was known. Virtually every sentence poses new puzzles. Furthermore, the elements that are postulated in the best theories could not possibly be found by a series of procedures. Just as in every other branch of science, the driving force in inquiry is imagination, conjecture. There's no algorithm for that. What's needed is the willingness to challenge established doctrine with better ideas. Explanation in the language case has to proceed at two levels. A generative grammar of a language is a theory that tries to explain its properties, the knowledge that's possessed by the language user. At a deeper level, the theory of the shared language faculty is concerned with the innate factors that make language acquisition possible, the factors that distinguish humans from all other organisms. Modern terms, that's called universal grammar, UG. It's adapting a traditional term to a new framework. Well, UG has goals that appear contradictory. It must meet at least three conditions. First, UG must be rich enough to overcome what's called the problem of poverty of stimulus. That is the fact that what is acquired, demanded, lies far beyond any evidence available. Second problem, UG must be simple enough to have evolved under the conditions of human evolution. Third, UG must be the same for all possible languages, given the fact there's no biological adaptation to specific languages. Well, we achieve a genuine explanation of some linguistic phenomenon only if it keeps the mechanisms that satisfy the joint conditions of learnability, evolvability, and universality, which appear to be at odds. The course of theoretical inquiry has been driven by the goal of reconciling these conflicting requirements. These problems were evident at the outset of the generative enterprise, mid-20th century. We now know that they are considerably more severe than what was assumed at the time. With regard to evolvability, genetic studies have shown that humans began to separate not long after their appearance, at least 150,000 years ago. There are no known differences in language faculty, so it must already have been in place. Furthermore, there's no meaningful evidence of any symbolic activity prior to the emergence of Homo sapiens. Well, these facts suggest that language emerged pretty much along with modern humans. If so, we would expect that the basic structure of language should be quite simple, the result of some relatively small rewiring of the brain that took place once and has not changed in the brief period since. The apparent problem, the apparent contradiction with learnability, there severe. Research on language acquisition has extended the dilemma further. It's shown that a child of 2 or 3 years old has already mastered basic properties of its language, including some quite remarkable ones. Does not exhibit this knowledge, but experiment shows that it has it. Furthermore, statistical study of the data available to the child shows that relevant evidence is very sparse. These discoveries seem to require that UG be rich enough in order to overcome the enormous gap between data available and knowledge attained, while the evolvability condition demands the opposite, that UG be very restricted, and the problem of endless variation, apparently endless variation, that lurks in the background. That's the conundrum. In the past few years, some hope has finally emerged to resolve this tangle of dilemmas within what's been called the minimalist program. We can see how, by looking at a fundamental and quite puzzling universal property of language problem, the property called structure dependence. So just think about a very simple sentence and its properties, which are mastered by 2-year-old children, as experiment has shown. So take the sentence, the boy and the girl are in the room. Notice it's are in the room, not is in the room. See, that raises puzzles. To determine agreement, the child does not use the simplest computational rule, adjacency. Rather, the child reflexively relies on something it never hears, the structure that its mind creates. The child then assigns plurality by virtue of the nature of this abstract structure, the coordination. That problem quickly extends to much more complex cases. So take the sentences, the bombing of the cities was a crime. The bombings of the city were crimes. Well, to decide whether to use was or were, singular or plural, we ignore linear adjacency. We attend only to the structure, the full noun phrase subject. But we have to go beyond that to find the central element of the noun phrase, bombing or bombings. Far more complex computation than linear adjacency, which is reflexively ignored. Let's take it a step further. Consider the sentence, the mechanic who fixed the car carefully packed his tools. It's ambiguous. Did he fix the car carefully, or did he carefully pack the tools? Well, now put the adverb carefully in front of the sentence. Carefully, the mechanic who fixed the car packed his tools. It's now unambiguous. It means that he carefully packed his tools. The adverb carefully seeks a verb, but it cannot use the simplest computation. Find the nearly closest verb. It has to, UG forces us to ignore that simple computation and to select the more remote verb, which happens to be the structurally closest verb, as you see when you assign the structure that our mind tells us is the correct way. Well, it goes without saying that none of this can possibly be learned. So we therefore have a puzzle. The infant ignores 100% of what it hears, linear order, mind constructs. Furthermore, this is true of all constructions in all languages. The only possible answer is that linear order is simply not available to the child who is acquiring the system that constructs thought. So why then does speech require linearization? Well, the reason is obvious. The articulatory system cannot produce structures, so the externalization process must impose linear order on an internal system of generation of thoughts which has no order. Sign language is less strictly linear because of wider options that are available in visual space, while the sensory motor systems that are used for externalization have nothing at all to do with language. They were in place long before language emerged. They have not changed. True language is the internal system that generates thoughts. The I language, internal to an individual, coded as a recursive generative process somewhere, somehow in the brain. So we now face the question, why does the infant reflexively ignore 100% of what it hears? Why does it ignore 100% of what it hears, linear order, and attend only to what it never hears, abstract structures constructed by the mind? There is a straightforward answer. Satisfaction of the basic property requires a computational procedure. The simplest computational procedure is what's called binary set formation, called merge in recent work. And it's very easy to show that if recursive generation is based on merge, then structure dependence is automatically imposed and there's no linear order. There are many consequences. One consequence is that certain thoughts become inexpressible in speech, even very simple ones. So to illustrate, shift from conjunction to disjunction. Take the sentences, either John or Mary is in the room. Either the boys, the girls, or the boys are in the room. Both fine. How about either the girls or John is in the room? No good. Either the boys or John are in the room. No good. Neither is possible. The thought is very clear. And if number agreement were based on adjacency, easily expressed. But with structure dependence, the thought is inexpressible in the simplest way. You have to produce some complex paraphrase. This is one of a great many examples of conflict between optimal design and utility for communication. There are many others that are far more serious than this one. They're always resolved in the same way. Communicative efficiency is always sacrificed. To put it metaphorically, when Mother Nature was constructing language, she was concerned with optimal design, not with how the system might be used. If it turns out to be dysfunctional, so be it. It's worth noting that that's how evolution works quite generally. We can distinguish 3 steps in normal evolutionary change. The first step is innovative. Some disruption takes place. Maybe a mutation. Maybe a bacterium accidentally swallows some other microorganism. It's what led to eukaryotic cells, complex cells, the basis for complex life, something new. Then comes the second step, reconstruction. Nature redesigns the system in the simplest way, satisfying natural law. Then comes the third and final step, winnowing. Natural selection reduces the variety to the better adapted. The simplest solution produced at the second step might be dysfunctional, but nature doesn't care. In reconstruction, nature seeks optimal design. It has no way to consider possible functions. That's the general story about evolution. Well, language seems to fit the normal pattern, so we can envision an evolutionary scenario that looks something like this. Some small rewiring of the brain yielded the property, the general property of recursive generation. Nature then took the usual course of seeking the simplest such operation, relied on natural law, in this case, principles of computational efficiency. The result is a system based on merge, which satisfies the basic property. Its deepest, most surprising property, structure dependence, follows at once with its ramified consequences. UG encodes the outcome. The infant, therefore, reflexively ignores everything it hears and attends only to the abstract structures its mind creates, fleshed out as thoughts. Well, in these terms, we can envision a resolution of grammar. The diversity condition, the third condition, can be put to the side in the study of the core system of generation of thought. The variety of languages might be localized largely in peripheral aspects of the lexicon and externalization. Perhaps completely, we may sometime learn pretty much Aristotle's picture. Research seems to me to be tending in that direction. Would be a natural outcome. The property of stimulus conditions on the core system are severe, sometimes clearly unsurmountable, as in the case of structure dependence. Furthermore, the sensory motor eye language amalgam poses a cognitive problem that can be solved in many ways. It would not be at all surprising to find that it is the locus of the complexity, the mutability of language, along with a variety, all superficial, if these ideas are on the right track. Again, that happens to be the classical conception from 2,500 years ago. Well, if that's right, at least for eye language, the conundrum is largely reduced to satisfying the evolvability condition. That problem will be overcome to the extent that the structures of eye language are generated by the simplest operations. What's called the strong minimalist thesis. Set outcome as a prime goal of the theory of language. That interesting progress has been made towards that goal just in the last few years. Notice that these observations reinforce the traditional view that language is essentially a system of thought. The modern doctrine that language is a system of communication that may have evolved from animal communication seems quite untenable. Well, returning to the evolutionary scenario, the winnowing stage, the stage of natural selection, may never have been reached. possibly because the system is so tightly integrated that it's either all or none. That's increasingly what we find when we investigate more complex cases. Well, instead of going on to further cases of genuine explanation, let's turn to how thoughts are fleshed out. Our language is a computational system. Any such system has primitive elements, atoms of computation, has computational procedures to form new elements out of them. For language, the primitives are the minimum meaning-bearing elements. In an analytic language like English, these are often words. So you have major books with titles like Words and Objects, W.V. Quine, Words and Things, Roger Brown, standard texts, philosophy of language, and language acquisition. For language, generally, word is not the right concept, even for English if you look closely. But let's keep to it anyway. It's close enough for English. These titles that I just quoted reflect a standard view that words are linked to mind external objects by the relation of reference. Words refer to things in the world. For the sciences, establishing such a relation is a norm. When scientists speak of uranium or genes or phonemes, they hope that there are such things. It also seems that animal communication systems observe this condition with a one-to-one relation between signals, say the call of a monkey, and some physically identifiable event. But there's good evidence that human language does not observe the referential doctrine. We use words to refer. That's an action. What the eminent British philosopher John Austin called a speech act. But when we look closely at the meanings of words, it's very hard to sustain the idea that there's a word-object relation. Take a standard example in philosophy language. Supposedly logically proper name, say London. Well, I can perfectly well say that I'm going to visit London again after it was destroyed by fire and rebuilt 50 miles up the Thames with different materials and different design. No one believes that there's a real-world entity with such properties as these. The fact is that the word London is not a proper name. It's rather a city name. And our mental concept city has rich and complex properties carried over when we use the word London in the speech act of referring. Now, that observation generalizes to the whole vocabulary. The basic point recognized by Aristotle. He discussed the word house. Aristotle observes that it's an amalgam of matter and form. The material part is what a physicist could identify. Bricks, timber, so on. The form is a mental construction. The design, the intention of the architect, the characteristic use, so on. So something could look exactly like the place where I'm speaking, my house, but it could actually be a library, or it could be a garage, or it could be a paperweight for a giant. These are not properties detectable by physical examination. Even earlier than Aristotle, a similar point was made by pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus when he asked how we can cross the same river twice, though its material component has changed. under radical material changes, it'll still be the same river, while under very slight changes, it will not be a river at all. Maybe a canal, maybe even a highway, if the surface is hardened and it's used for commuting. That turns out to be true of even the simplest words that we use to refer. What can be detected by observation tells you little about the meaning of words. Well, these features of language and thought raise new conundrums. All of this must be known about learning. There's no evidence for it. Correspondingly, must be shared cross-linguistically, all languages, in fundamental respects, just as Aristotle assumed. Studies of language acquisition have shown that these items are acquired on very few presentations, 2 or 3. That implies that they're based on rich, innate substructure. What we call learning is apparently a matter of setting relatively superficial properties. There are no analogs to such concepts, animal and all existence. There's no record of their development. Well, here we begin to reach the borders of understanding. In recent years, there have been many striking achievements. They open up new challenges and new mysteries. It's not an uncommon feature of scientific inquiry. It's one of the why it's endlessly fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Noam, for the wonderful talk that you have delivered. I would like to request Hassan for taking up a few questions from the audience. And I'm sure many people have sent their questions, so as long as Professor Noam Chomsky would be able to, Professor Hassan can take 10 minutes for question and answer. Over to Professor Hassan.
Thank you, Professor Warsi. Thank you, Professor Chomsky, for your insightful and illuminating lecture. It was a pleasure listening to you, sir. A living legend, your presence has greatly enriched the Department of Linguistics at AMU. In fact, I had a chance of listening to your lecture way back in 1996, when you had come to Delhi after a gap of over 25 years. And that was on language and mind, which had generated an unprecedented excitement among the academic community. I can see a similar excitement by the number of participants who wish to interact with you. However, we are constrained not to entertain all the questions. I will come with few questions. I understand we are short of time, and we also have considerations for the conditions that we have right now regarding your sustained lecture for such a long time, and I do not know how much you'll be able to really take many questions. But we can assure the audience that the questions will be sent to you, and should you wish to respond to them at a later stage, they'll be most happy to have your responses to their questions which remain unanswered. So with these words, I come to specific questions that have been raised here. The questions, there are some questions that will come from the audience directly. I would request them to raise them, and we'll take some from those questions. The questions that what do you mean by the concept of competence, and in what ways do you think these, I'm sorry, the questions are, these concepts have been applied in language teaching?
Well, competence and performance, just the modern technical term for Aristotle's distinction between possession of knowledge and use of knowledge. Those are two different things. We possess knowledge of arithmetic, but we use use our knowledge of arithmetic when we solve an equation or simply multiply numbers. But these are very different things. In our heads, our knowledge of arithmetic provides the answer to every computation. If I take two large numbers, say 491 and 8,672, and multiply them, the internal knowledge, my internal knowledge, gives an answer to that. But I can't do it. I can't produce that answer without paper and pencil and a lot of extra memory. That's use of knowledge. The internal knowledge is the rules of arithmetic just yield all the knowledge there is. It's inside, coded in our heads. But to use the knowledge is a very different thing. And it's the same with language. So my internal knowledge of English yields an infinite number of complex sentences. I can use this knowledge somehow. Incidentally, nobody knows how you decide to pick out a sentence from the infinite array in your head and decide to use it. Nobody knows. And while I can use it in some ways, Shakespeare could use it in ways that were far more aesthetically and intellectually significant. I can't do that. I appreciate what he did at that capacity, but not the capacity to produce it. Well, these are all various aspects of performance. Very little is understood about performance. It's mysterious. That's true even of the simplest actions. Trying to explain why I can lift my finger, let's say. Nobody understands that either. Why do I decide to do it this way and not that way, for example? There are no answers to that in neurophysiology. And certainly for the more complex questions of use of language, it's all total mystery, let alone what Barthe called the higher form of intelligence, the use of language in aesthetically and intellectually significant ways. Well, all of these are aspects of performance, almost total mystery for us. Competence, the internal system, knowledge of arithmetic, knowledge of language, and that poses many very serious complex issues, but in that domain we can make progress and have made progress.
There is a
question also asks how you can use this in language teaching. That's a different problem. Language teaching, like any kind of teaching, is about 95% motivation. If anybody who's a teacher of children or graduate students knows this, if the student is motivated, they want to learn, they can learn. Doesn't matter much what method you use, if they're better or worse ones. But the main problems is just make it interesting, arouse motivation, curiosity. Too much of education is the opposite. It kills curiosity. It dulls interest and motivation. You know, that's the wrong way. The right way is to cultivate interest and motivation. The natural interest that everyone has from an infant on through adulthood to try to understand. So cultivate that, then teaching will work.
Thank you very much, sir. There's another question that's there from how generative generalizations of minimalist grammar help language acquisition?
How does it help language acquisition? It's a little bit like asking a biologist when you study the nature of an organism, how does that help train an Olympic champion? Not directly. A trainer of an Olympic champion would do better if they know something about physiology and anatomy, but they're not going to get the answers there. These are practical applications of fundamental knowledge. It's quite interesting if you look at the history of science. Until quite recently, biology had very little to tell to medicine. The last century was actually the first time, with the destruction, the development of antibiotics and so on, that biology had much to tell to medicine. By now, it has a lot to tell. So if you go to medical school today, you're going to learn fundamental biology, because now it has something to contribute. But for millennia, it had almost nothing to contribute. It was an art. Medicine was an art that you somehow acquired. That's even true in engineering. I'll just tell you my own experience. I got MIT, where I spent most of my life as the world's leading engineering science university. When I got there in 1955, it was an engineering school. You taught students how to build things. There were great science and math departments, but they were service departments. They were providing tricks for the engineers. 10 years later, it was a science-based university. Engineering was on the side. If you wanted, whether you wanted to be an aeronautical engineer or mechanical engineer or whatever, you had to study the same basic science. Because for the first time in history, the sciences had reached the point where they were really telling you something fundamental about engineering practice. If you wanted to carry out engineering practice, you better understand the sciences. Well, those are recent developments in the most fundamental sciences, in things like the study of humans. We're far from that. Learning. There's still a huge gap between what's understood about the nature of humans and ways to apply this in the art of raising children, so on.
So there's another question. As per universal grammar, all languages are essentially the same in terms of grammar. How can this be tested?
How can it be tested?
Yes, sir.
Well, it can be tested by detailed, close investigation of a wide variety of typologically varied languages, which is exactly what's been done for the last roughly 50 years. As soon as the earliest work in the generative enterprise began, immediately it began to be applied to widely varied languages. Most in the early years, most of this work was at MIT, later spread around the rest of the world, very far around. So now it's everywhere. But in the 1960s, it was mostly MIT. And MIT very quickly became the world center for study of Aboriginal languages, Australian Aboriginal languages, Native American languages, African languages. Was mainly the work of a great scientist, Kenneth Hale, died a few years ago, an old friend, close friend, came to MIT in the 1960s and opened up all these studies. After that, it spread all over the place. So and what's been found is quite striking. So languages that look on the surface to be radically different from one another turn out to have the same fundamental principles when you study them in depth. More and more, that's what we're discovering, even with the most wildly different languages. And that's what you'd expect to find. Otherwise, it would be impossible to explain how any child learns any language. Remember, no child is biologically adapted to learning a particular language. You take a language from some tribe in the Amazon that hasn't had human contact for 20,000 years, other human contact. Bring him to Cambridge, Massachusetts. He'll be just like any other child there, go to MIT and study quantum physics. And conversely, take a child from Cambridge, Massachusetts, raise him in the depths of the Amazon jungle. He'll learn all of the remarkable skills and talents that every child there has. How to pick the right kind of fruit from a tree, so on. Very complicated. There's no adaptation, which means that the child comes to language acquisition with only the information that this is a human language. That's built in. And on the basis of that, with very little evidence, very little, the child becomes a fluent native speaker of the particular language. Well, just from the general nature of that phenomenon, you can conclude with fair confidence that all languages are fundamentally the same, that the differences lie in some superficial things, like how you pronounce this word or how you pronounce that word. Does the verb precede the object? Does the object precede the verb? And it turns out that that's what we're going to have to find. And more we're coming towards that. Very different from what was believed during the structuralist period. At that point, mid-20th century, it was universally assumed that languages can vary in almost any possible way, and each one has to be studied in its own terms. When you don't understand any topic, that's the way it looks. It looks as if it's all total chaos. Incidentally, the same is true in biology. We go back mid-20th century, it was assumed in biology that organisms can vary in just about every possible way, and each one has to be studied on its own. It's now known that that's completely false. The constraints on possible organisms are very rigid. There are very few possible organisms. There are what are called laws of form that just determine what constitutes a possible living organism. This has actually reached the point where it's been suggested seriously that there may be a universal genome, single genome for all of life, with minor variations around the outside. Now, that's not proven, but it's considered a plausible thesis. And I think we're finding the same in language. And as a general point, you approach some phenomena, complicated phenomena, it looks unintelligible. Take a look at leaves blowing in the wind. There could possibly be laws of motion. It's just too chaotic. Well, this has proved the opposite. When you look at the simple cases, you're puzzled about how they work. You can find fundamental principles which expand, in some cases over the centuries, and finally giving you a grasp of how the world works in some areas. Other areas remain very mysterious, like production of language.
Thank you. In the light of language, I-language and E-language, can we say that the cognitive linguistics is up to finding correspondences between these two conceptual frames of language?
Well, what's called cognitive linguistics is a pretty obscure field, in my opinion. Maybe you can make more sense of it than I can. All of linguistics is concerned with the question of what's the nature of the internal language? How does it manifest itself in the external systems? What's the process of externalization? You have an internal system, probably the same for all languages. It can be externalized in speech the usual way, can be externalized in sign, the language of the deaf, about the same processes, same internal structure. Can even be done by touch. Helen Keller type example. It's very hard, but possible. Sensory motor systems have nothing to do with language at all. As I said, they were there millions of years before language ever appeared. They haven't changed. The internal system maps on to those external things. It's done in many different ways. That's where the apparent variety of language lies primarily. It seems that the internal systems are the same. Personally, there is interesting work in what's called cognitive linguistics. Leonard Talmey's work on somatic properties, for example, is quite illuminating. But the general field itself doesn't seem to me to have coherent formulation. It's my opinion. It's a confused way of looking at the problems we're all interested in.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky. There are two very small queries. One is head movement still phonological? And second one is, what does the lexicon contain?
The first one was about head movement.
Head movement still being phonological.
Well, this is a little bit technical, so it's for those of you who know something about the field. The operation of head movement, like for raising a verb to tense or something like that, raising a verb to second position or something. That's used, very commonly used, but it's unformulable. There is no way in any known generative procedure to formulate that rule. If you look at it closely, you can see why. It violates the extension condition. If you raise a verb to tense, it forms a unit in which, according to the rules, the verb is adjoined to the tense. It can't be. The tense is adjoined to the verb. It has it exactly backwards. And furthermore, it violates extension. So you can't formulate it. That makes it look like a phonological rule. On the other hand, there are arguments against that. Namely, it seems to be cyclical. So a substantive root can adjoin to a verbal element, that can adjoin to a tense, that can move on to the basic clause-forming element, complementizer, step by step. Phonology doesn't do that, so it looks syntactic. So it was a real problem. We just have, for the first time, some answers to this in Axiom. It's discussed in a paper that just came out today. It happens in Japan, a paper of mine on modern minimalist theory, which offers an answer to how this could work through kind of morphological amalgamation, which doesn't use rules. Here's in the Journal of the Japanese Linguistic Society if you have internet connections.
Thank you, Reza.
You can take two more questions.
Two more questions.
Because I can see there are more than 50 questions, so it is just list of questions. And Professor Chomsky was so being generous to give us that. So like last two questions you can take. I can see like people from our own department like Noam, Tahir, Mahvis, Shamim, Sabat, Habibur Rahman, and one Dr. Saleh Jani from English department. There are many like this. So just please take last two questions before we go for both of them.
Okay, all right. Sorry, but I couldn't grasp the question. Could you repeat it?
No, sir, it was not questions. It was for just I was requesting Professor Imtiaz Aslan to take last two questions for you. Because we have received more than 50 questions for you.
There's a question. Can I ask?
Could it be written in the chat? I see some questions are being be written because I can't hear it.
Yeah, Professor Imtiaz sir will take the question and sir, two more questions for you, sir.
Okay, I'll just, since we have time constraint, Professor Chomsky, and I've been asked by the chairperson not to take more than 2 questions. So I'll take up 2 questions. One is, what role does cognition play in acquisition and development of language?
Cognition is a very broad term. Our intellectual cognitive capacities play all kinds of roles in doing anything. So when a child's acquiring language, and first of all, it has a huge problem of what's called extracting signal from noise. If you were to speak to me in, say, whatever your native language happens to be, to me it would just be noise. I would just hear a lot of noise. I wouldn't hear anything. Well, that's what a child is hearing noise. It has to pick the signals out from the noise. What's the language? What part of this noise constitutes language? It's a huge problem. Children do it reflexively, no problem. They're just built to do it, to pick it out. It's part of their nature. Pick out what's the signal, what's the noise. To try to duplicate that with computational algorithms is extremely complex. But children do it instantaneously, just the way a newborn lamb knows instantaneously how to nurse. Why does it pick that out of all the possible things that could happen? Well, that's the way organisms work. They're designed to do particular things. Incidentally, I picked the lamb example because my wife happens to have sheep, and we just had new lambs, but so I watched it. But all of life is like that. Organisms are specifically designed to do specific particular things, and they can do them in ways that we can try to understand but are quite complex. So in the case of language acquisition, from the beginning, picking out the signal from the noise on to determining what a word is, what a sentence is, how you get the universal properties of such as structure dependence. All of this involves cognitive processes. But we're built to do it. Other organisms can't do it. We can't do what they can do. I live in the desert. There are ants out in my backyard that can carry out cognitive feats that vastly surpass anything that humans can do. Navigational feats humans can only barely duplicate with complex instruments. And they have brains so small you need a microscope to see them. Well, that's the way they're designed. We're all different in our own ways. So yes, of course, cognition enters in the specific ways that we're designed to use.
Yes, sir, please. Professor Imtiaz.
Yes, I can.
Yeah, sir. I'm talking to Professor Imtiaz Ismail, sir. I think he lost his connections. And so I can request, he's moderating the question and answer. So if Professor Imtiaz Ismail is connected, then he can take one more question to for Professor Noam Chomsky. If he's not getting connected, then I am sorry, we will not take any more questions. I can see there are more than 50-60 questions in the chat box, and we cannot entertain. Otherwise, it will take 2 more hours for Professor Noam Chomsky to answer those questions.
I have to go off to another talk, I'm afraid.
Okay, yes, sure, that's what I am saying. So may I request, without any delay, may I request Professor Shabana Hamid to formally thank Professor Noam Chomsky. Professor Shabana Hamid, please.
Thank you, Professor Warsi. evening, good afternoon, and good morning to everyone present here from across the globe in different time zones. It is such an honor for me to get this opportunity to propose a vote of thanks to the distinguished speaker and all the participants in today's lecture. I personally, on behalf of the Department of Linguistics, Aligarh Muslim University, would like to express our heartfelt gratitude to Professor Noam Chomsky for this highly enlightening address on the topic Human Capacity, Language and Thought, emphasizing intricacies involving thought and language that have association with some kind of mental organization which is unique to humans. This day will go down in the history of this university as one of the most cherished, as today a thinker par excellence, an academician of the caliber and status of Professor Chomsky was amongst us and became a part of this great seat of learning. It is indeed a red letter day for this university and for all of us. Thank you, Professor Chomsky, for taking time out for us from your extremely busy schedule. It was indeed an enriching experience listening to your insightful and thought-provoking lecture. We are extremely grateful to the Honorable Vice Chancellor of Muslim University, Professor Tariq Mansoor, for his unflinching support for today's program and all our academic endeavors. Sir, with your support and guidance, the department successfully a series of e-lectures by eminent scholars from diverse fields of linguistics, including today's address by a stalwart like Professor Chomsky. It is indeed my pleasant duty to show our gratitude to the Registrar of the University, Mr. Abdul Hamid, IPS, for his support and for always coming forward to help the department in its various activities. We would like to extend our thanks to the Dean, Faculty of Arts, Professor Sayyid Muhammad Hashim, for being there whenever we need him and for helping us organize this lecture. The Chairman, Department of Linguistics, Professor Jahangir Warsi, needs special mention for his constant efforts and commitment towards the growth and development of the department. He has been instrumental in regularly organizing lectures and webinars for the benefit of students and faculty. His contributions in the department is praiseworthy and will go a long way in taking the department to new heights. I will fail in my duty if I do not propose a hearty vote of thanks to all the participants who graced the occasion and were live with us today. Their presence in us speaks volumes for the intellectual depth, scholarly content, and academic value of today's event. We are also thankful to our senior colleague, Professor Imtiaz Hasnan, for moderating today's event. His handling of the proceedings has only added to the academic essence of this evening. It is indeed a pleasure to extend a heartfelt thanks to all the organizing committee members and my colleagues in the department without whose active participation this wonderful event would not have been possible. Last but not the least, we especially thank the non-teaching support staff of the Department of Linguistics for their untiring efforts and for providing technical help in bridging distances and connecting us globally on one platform. Thank you all once again. Thank you, Professor Chomsky.
Thank you all. As chair of the department, I would like to thank Professor Noam Chomsky. It is really a privilege and a rare opportunity to have got to interact with you, sir. So thank you for your time, thank you for your generosity, and thank you for being available for us. Thank you, and we hope in future, when the pandemic is getting over, we would love to have you in India one more time.